He said he'd pay $1,000 to anyone who could translate it. The crowd heard through the polite roar, an amused challenge tossed like a coin. The man in the tailored suit laughed, the laugh you hear in boardrooms and airports, practiced and sure it will land where he expects it to. Phones tilted toward him, faces smoothed into the polite smile that follows spectacle. He flicked a leather wallet onto the hood of his car, revealing a small, faded scrap of paper with looping letters in a language meant to him like a puzzle, exotic, irrelevant, worth a bet. Then, just beyond the circle of polished shoes and polite applause, the asphalt glowed. Sunlight made the chrome of cars harsh as mirrors. In the narrow shadow of a black sedan, a small hand slid a warm pastry beneath a wheel, tucking it away as carefully as if hiding a secret. The smell, salt, oil, cinnamon, or spice, hung like a quiet promise in the hot air. He had seen shopping center parking lots 1,000 times. He had also seen people in ways arranged and labeled, opportunities, interruptions, causes he could fund from a distance. Today his laugh was a currency. He offered $1,000 for translation, as if translation itself were a thing to be bought and traded, a simple transaction to be witnessed. A child named Sam, no one in the crowd would have known him, moved like a small tide between cars. His hair was wind-stubborn, his jacket patched, his shoes with a history of walks. He was 7, maybe 8, old enough to understand the world's rough edges, young enough that his courage still rose with little cause. He had hidden the pastry because some older boys said it smelled like luck and would take it. He had hidden it because his grandmother had smiled at him that morning and told him to save it for the evening, when their breath would be fog and the oven of the shelter would be closed. He had hidden it because small things matter when the world is big and indifferent. When the polished man and his entourage moved toward the wallet on the hood, the crowd's laugh faltered into a ripple of chatter. The man, Elliot Chase, leaned down to read the faded words, pronouncing them with the slotted confidence of someone used to being understood. Sam, crouched low, had one hand over the pastry and the other pressing against the asphalt. He heard sneakers. The man's shoes were close to his head, and a shadow fell like a curtain. For a moment, Sam considered crawling away unseen. He thought of his grandmother cross-stitching the hem of a blanket, of the single lamp that warmed their cot, of how the pastry would taste when finally shared. He popped up and called, small voice clear in the summer air. "Hey, sir, watch the wheel." Elliot glanced over, amused. People turn their heads when small voices intrude on adult matters. An aide smiled, assuming the interruption a kind of street theater. Some in the crowd craned for a photograph.
Elliot's face registered the boy, patchwork jacket, earnest eyes. Then the pastry beneath the car. For a fraction of a second, something like inconvenience slickered over his features. Then amusement returned. He crouched with the deliberate theatricality of a man who knows the cameras follow. "Is that yours?" he asked, as if asking the question would keep the moment on a leash. He had no idea how soon his day could tilt on a reply. Sam nodded. He stepped forward with a slowness that was practiced, as if he were moving through a lesson learned in silence. "It's for my grandma," he said. The words were small, but he said them as if announcing something true and unarguable. "She saved a little, so we could share it tonight." The crowd exhaled. Someone said, not unkindly, "Aw." But with Elliot, pity was a currency he didn't often spend. He collected it like a museum collects relics, beautiful to possess, but kept at a distance. He smiled, the smile that said this was entertaining. "You shouldn't hide food under cars," he said, his voice warm with the careful diplomacy of someone taught to navigate social currents. Sam reached out and offered half the pastry, one small slice pressed into his palm like the most ordinary offering in the world. Not asking, not bargaining, offering. "You can have this if you want it," he said. His eyes didn't flick away from Elliot's face. They were steady, small beacons. A pause in the air. Something fragile and true had been handed across the span between well-pressed fabric and patched jacket. Elliot laughed, the same rich sound that had floated earlier. "I'll translate whatever you want for $1,000, he said before he could stop himself, an offhand joke that had nothing to lose. It landed differently now. Phones tilted. Someone in the crowd clicked the record button. "Who here wants to be paid $1,000 to translate a scrap of paper?" he asked, half parody, half provocation. He imagined the applause. He imagined the anecdote. "I once offered $1,000 in a parking lot." He imagined that story landing well at the quarterly board meeting, an amusing aside about eccentric generosity. Sam's hand, still cupped with the warm pastry, trembled a fraction. He was not the sort to understand performance fully. He felt only that the man had spoken a word the way you speak to denote value, as if meaning could be negotiated at the cost of cash. Still, he raised his voice so the crowd could hear. "What does it say?" he asked, on the paper. Elliot, delighted by the drama of it, held out the scrap. Sunlight caught the ink. The letters were smudged. There were words, single, dense words, as if someone had written them quickly on a train. For the men who catalogued everything by ledger and label, it was a puzzle. For the boy, it was a possible doorway. He took the paper, and the world seemed to fold inward. The words read, Ogar, a single word that to many ears would sound like an exotic riddle.
To Sam, who had grown up with a grandmother who sometimes hummed lullabies in Spanish and called their small patched blanket Ogar, the letters were not exotic. They were a hand pulling him back to the only place he could imagine warm. He looked at Elliot and said, bright as a bell, Ogar means home. Laughter hit the air, the nervous laugh of those who expect novelty to be neatly resolved. Elliot's smile thinned. He had offered money to translate the thing because translation, to him, had been a clean transaction. But there, in the boy's simple, unadorned translation, a word landed as a mirror. He remembered, suddenly and unobtrusively, a postcard with messy handwriting he had once shoved into a drawer and then forgotten. His mother, perhaps, asking him to come home for a holiday he'd been too busy to schedule. He remembered his apartment, minimalist and tidy, that had never needed a warm corner because every corner was curated. The city noise receded. Someone coughed. Sam turned and lifted the pastry again, as if to offer it for ritual. His small generosity was a quiet thunder. He had nothing, and yet he gave. Elliot felt something like a bruise under his ribs. For the first time that morning, the world's equations didn't balance in his favor. "You did it," a woman from HR said later, her voice low as they walked away from the circle. Hannah was the type who kept records not only of invoices, but of how people behaved. She had seen philanthropic gestures packaged as spectacle before. Elliot's hand closed around his keys so tightly the knuckles whitewashed. It was a joke, he said, a half-hearted laugh trying to find refuge in the open air. But the boy had translated more than a single word. He had translated intent into thing. A concept, home, was now tangible, lodged in Elliot's throat and refusing to be swallowed. In the car, after the crowd dispersed into the hum of commerce, Elliot watched the passenger side door reflect the sun like a second blind. He thought about numbers, quarterly projections, a pending merger, a home he had once inherited and then sold because it didn't fit the aesthetic of success. Success, he had discovered, sounded like a clean ledger and looked like a spare, uncluttered apartment. It did not taste like warm pastry or listen for the small inhalations of a child. The next morning, he could have filed it away. He could have put the incident in the file of odd public interactions and gone on, as before, to buy time and space with meetings and deals. Instead, he found himself driving back to the parking lot, not because he owed a boy money, or because he habitually kept promises made jokingly, but because the scratch of the word in his head, Ogar, would not be soothed by indifference. When he pulled into the center's lot again, the sun broke the asphalt into heat-haze mosaics. He saw Sam at once, the same patchy jacket, the same small, wary posture that habits of survival produce. Sam was not alone. A woman sat on the bench by the curb, grandmother-sized in her presence, hands with the softness of work, eyes that registered hardship but made room for humor. Her name was Rosa, though to him she would be a person in need, and he felt uncomfortable with labels. She waved a hand when she saw the car. Sam's face brightened, not because of expectation, but because he had learned that small gestures mattered. Elliot stepped out of his car with a box of sandwiches, a corporate noonday decision turned domestic by hunger. He told himself he would hand them out and leave. He would be charitable and irreproachable. He would not be sentimental. Sam took a sandwich and split it with his grandmother. The bread steamed, the filling a small consolation. Elliot watched the exchange, like a zoologist might watch a rare animal. There was distance in observation, curiosity, and a deep, private cataloging of details. He noticed Rosa's throat move as she chewed, the way her eyes softened when she saw the boy smiling. The simplicity of it embarrassed him. He had given the sandwiches in part to expiate private discomfort, the memory of Hallgars, of letters put away,
of a life where meaning was often translated into the language of accumulation. Word reached the office before noon. A photograph circulated in the company chat. Elliot handing sandwiches to a woman and a boy in a parking lot. The image floated over cubicles and through headphones, a small rumor. Some called it performative. One colleague typed a laughing emoji and asked if Elliot had just invented pay-for-translation philanthropy. Another forwarded the snapshot to the PR team, suggesting a staged event with better lighting. But Hannah, HR, sent a private message. "If you're thinking of doing something, do it well," she wrote. "Short-term handouts feel like patches. If we're serious about community responsibility, there are sustainable ways to help." Her message read like a reminder that charity can be thoughtful or careless. Elliot read it and felt both challenged and strangely relieved. He had been a man who lived in decisions. Now he was confronted with the need to make a decision that could not be recorded simply as a line on a balance sheet. At his desk, Elliot's office looked over the city in the way that penthouses watch the world below, high, removed, with excellent sightlines. He sat down and opened a blank document titled Corporate Social Initiative, Heart. The letters looked small and labored on the screen. He was capable of plans, of implementation charts and budgets. He could summon a task force and a slide deck. It would all be clean. It would all be presentable. Most important, it would show that he had responded. But the part of the decision he did not anticipate was how small his immediate impulses were. He found himself visiting a shelter vendor catalog, measuring how many blankets could be purchased with an initial donation.
He thought about offering Rosa something more substantial than sandwiches, a voucher for the clinic at the community center, a small monthly stipend so she could sleep better, a connection to a caregiver who could manage paperwork, an introduction to the shelter's housing coordinator. He considered ease and consequence. The ledger he was used to balancing now had edges that were people. Across from him, in the conference room, a meeting was scheduled. Mark, a vice president who liked to sharpen his opinions into weapons, sat with arms folded. He specialized in efficient cynicism. "This is optics," Mark said bluntly. "We're not a charity, we're a company. We have fiduciary duty." He rubbed his thumb across the fingertip of his pen. Other executives nodded, the kind of assent that keeps company pulse neat. They were all afraid of something they had named. Elliot had to decide which fear would guide him, the fear of being seen as foolish or the fear of living a life that felt small when woken in the night. He surprised him. He proposed a pilot program, not a one-time publicity sweep, but a modest, structured effort to partner with local organizations. He suggested an on-site kitchen hour where employees could volunteer to prepare food for the shelter. He suggested a program to help staff like Rosa navigate benefits, paperwork, and job training consultation. He suggested that the company hire a community liaison, someone who could shepherd neighbors into services instead of filtering them into spectacle. There was immediate noise. "Do we have the bandwidth?" someone asked. A spreadsheet ghosted across collective faces. Mark's eyebrow raised in disbelief. "You want payroll to fund people to cook sandwiches?" he snapped. Elliot felt himself answering in a voice he barely recognized at first, slow, frank. "It's not about sandwiches," he said. "It's about translating our capacity into something useful. Money can be a blunt instrument. What we translate it into, services, pathways, dignity, that's what matters." He used the word translate aloud and felt the memory of Sam's nugget of meaning pulse under his skin. The room slid back into calculations. But Hannah came forward quietly, the way someone offers a thread to tie. "We can start small," she said. "We can partner with the community center Sam and Rosa use. We can pilot job readiness on the second Tuesday of the month. We can match volunteer hours with micro grants for housing applications." Her practical list sounded less like charity and more like architecture for something steady. Elliot approved a modest pilot. The decision was the first concrete thing he had made, not dictated by profit margins or market share. It was also, to his surprise, not purely altruistic.
It scratched at a place inside him that had been raw for reasons he had not named. A postcard folded in a drawer, a mother who had asked him to come home, a boy who had shared a pastry he could have bought with 1/100th of a minute's profit. Outside the office window, life continued in its usual geometry.
Cars like white stones, the skitter of pedestrians, the slow exhale of cloud. Elliot felt small, and so did the decision feel small. That smallness was new territory for him. Often he delved in large solutions that scaled upward. Smallness felt honest. He sent Hannah a note. Arrange a meeting with the community center. Start with a needs assessment. Let's budget the pilot. He pressed send and then, as if needing to anchor himself, went back to the parking lot. Sam and Rosa were there again. The pastry had become a small thread between them. It was not about value in dollars, but about the fact that someone had noticed and cared. Elliot handed them an envelope, modest cash for immediate needs, and then worse, or better, he spoke. He asked their names again. He listened to Rosa list practical obstacles, the stack of forms, the long line at the clinic, the confusion around ID requirements. He listened as Sam spoke about school libraries he missed and the Boy Scouts troop he had once wanted to join. No promises, Elliot said, which was the truth. Promises without follow-through are cruelty veiled as generosity. He said, "We'll take it step by step." He spoke of a program being set up, modest, planned, accountable. He folded the conversation into reality with the clarity he had used all his life in meetings, but now the inability to hide behind spreadsheets made him more honest. He did not know how it would look months from now. He did not know whether Mark or others would resist when the PR wagons arrived. He only knew that the word Sam had translated, Hogar, refused to be boxed into a rhetorical exercise. As he drove away that afternoon, the image of the boy offering half a pastry replayed like an old film burned into memory. Small hand, warm bread, steady eyes. He thought about translation, how it can be literal, moving letters from one language to another, or deep, turning a gesture into an understanding, converting small kindness into action. He thought of money and its limitations. $1,000 would have been a tidy anecdote, a neat moment to recount. The affair had become messy with reality, names, forms, people who had histories and needs that would not vanish with a check. Back at headquarters, the corridor buzzed. Some called him idealistic, others wished he would be less visible. Mark dialed into the meeting and reminded everyone of shareholder expectations. "We cannot be the city's social services," he declared, wary emptiness in his voice like a bell. He drew charts, and the charts had clean lines that suggested containment. Elliot sat quietly through the spin.
He had the choice to fold the moment into spectacle, to let PR package a photo op and call it community engagement. He had a different impulse now, a quieter one, which Hannah saw and encouraged. "We begin with a kitchen," she said. "We begin with paperwork help. We begin with listening, not with press releases." That evening, walking across the marble lobby, Elliot found himself stopping at a wall of framed photographs. Smiling executives at ribbon cuttings, handshakes, ceremonial checks. He could imagine his own face in one of those frames, formal, smiling, perhaps with a plaque describing a grant. He thought about whether he wanted to be immortalized for the right reason. For Sam, the next days blurred into a soft thread of routine. The shelter's kitchen served a warm meal on Sundays. Someone from the company came by to see how things were. There was a faint hope, the kind that arrives when someone empowered does something steady instead of grandstanding. Rosa met with a liaison who printed forms in clear fonts and explained the process twice. These small acts did not fix her past or erase the nights she had gone to sleep with a stomach empty enough to ache, but when someone walked with her through a complicated form, it mattered. It bought a sliver of dignity in a system that often vaporized it. At the office, Mark grumbled that Elliot was doing theater. "Good deeds are fine," he said to the group in a voice meant to steady, "but make sure they align with the mission." His hands described a net, catching impulses and folding them into policy. Some agreed, others felt quietly unsettled. There is always a moment when a company recalibrates. People shift chairs. Habits are tested. Elliot felt judged and also oddly liberated. Judgment is a predictable thing. Liberation is rarer. He had, for the first time in months, chosen an action that could not be marketed into neatness without losing its essential discomfort. He had to live with the outcomes, not with the photograph. He began showing up in small ways, not as a celebrity, but as a practical man who could navigate systems. he signed off on a small room in the office that became a drop-in space for people like Rosa to receive help filling forms. He allocated a modest budget for food vouchers and for emergency transit cards for those who needed them to get to interviews or clinics. He asked the facilities team to convert an unused pantry into a community kitchen where employees could volunteer an hour to cook meals and speak with neighbors. Mark's eyebrows climbed with every modest item. "We will be spending staff time on food?" he asked, incredulous. "We're not a soup kitchen." Hannah answered with the kind of clarity that wins small battles. "We will be spending staff time on connection," she said. "If connection reduces churn, improves morale, and builds a community around our workplace, then it aligns with mission. If it simply makes our brand look good, then it's hollow."
Let's aim for the former. Elliot found himself at the center of small, consequential choices. He was not led by an epiphany so much as by the accumulation of small truths. A boy sharing a pastry, a grandmother's steady hands, a word that meant home. One afternoon, as he walked back toward his car under the same harsh sun, he caught sight of Sam playing at a little distance with a battered soccer ball. The boy kicked it with fierce concentration. There was the same small dignity, the kind that comes from having practiced a skill not because you will profit from it, but because it makes the hours brighter. Elliot stopped and watched. For a moment they regarded each other like two people who had stumbled into an agreement with life to be kinder. He had thought at first to pay the boy the $1,000 for speaking the word, for making a joke into something marketable. But the happening had already translated itself into something else, a simmering plan, a shift in a company's small routines, a promise that someone would try to turn attention into service. The $1,000 was no longer the point. The translation had already begun. Sam kicked the ball toward him, grinning, as if inviting participation. Elliot hesitated, then bent and picked it up. He was awkward and out of practice. The first pass was clumsy, knocked sideways by his cuff. Sam laughed, delighted. Laughter can be a currency too, the kind that buys a moment out of the ledger of days. Elliot walked away from the lot that day with a strange lightness. He felt the tug of something that might be larger than a single program. He felt the burden too, the knowledge that good intentions often fray unless someone kept them mended. He decided quietly that he would be the one to mend them, not theatrically, but steadily. He could not promise a grand solution. He could promise he would wake, and for once, translate his wealth into relationship. When he returned to the office, his phone buzzed with messages, board updates, performance alerts, a calendar full of meetings with people who tended to economies and margins. There was also a short text from Hannah. "The kitchen needs volunteers tomorrow. Will you come?" He stared at the message for a long time, thinking of the pastry's warmth and of Sam's small open hand. Then he typed simply, "Yes." There would be pushback. There would be meetings where he'd have to justify the cost in line items. There would be Mark's barbs and shareholders' patience tested. There would be no overnight fix for systemic problems. But there would also be mornings of simple work, training sessions, forms explained aloud, sandwiches passed between strangers until strangers looked less strange. As dusk thickened, he found himself replaying how the crowd had laughed when he offered the $1,000. What had once been comedy had become an invitation. Translation, he understood now, was not merely about language.
It was about converting what you had, money, attention, access, into what someone else needed. A steady hand, a way forward, an act that acknowledges someone as human. The next day, as teams hummed and numbers recalculated into profit forecasts, Elliot sat on the edge of a different sort of ledger. He had put a small fund into motion and appointed Hannah to lead the pilot. He had asked the facilities manager to set aside a room. He had told no one at the top table that he intended to participate in the kitchen himself, to stand and ladle soup into paper bowls alongside interns and contract workers and the woman who swept the break room. He did not need applause. He needed practice. But choice breeds consequence. Across the office, Mark sharpened an email. Shareholder meetings love predictability and worry in patterns. A philanthropic pivot invited curiosity, and that often becomes scrutiny. Some colleagues whisper that his actions were impulsive, others that they were performative. The truth, as always, lived between whispers and hearsay. Elliot had, in a short moment in a parking lot, been handed a mirror he couldn't ignore. He had chosen to look back. And Sam? For now, he kept a small reserve of hope, the deliberate kind that children construct out of thrift and necessity. He kept it like a stone in his pocket. He would not let himself expect too much. He had learned too early that expectancy and disappointment traveled the same roads. But he watched the office staff come to the kitchen one Tuesday and saw that some hands were different when they worked. He watched volunteers listen when Rosa spoke, and he felt a certain warmth that rivaled the pastries. It was not the same as $1,000 lining up like a neat answer. It was the slow translation of attention into practical help, a translation that takes patience and paperwork and polite forms. Weeks passed, and small, messy things began to seed. A pantry stocked with hygiene kits, a schedule of volunteer hours, a liaison who sat with Rosa and helped her file a crucial application, a company internal memo that spoke of a pilot and used the word empathy with careful restraint. Mark still grumbled. There were still arguments about budget and priorities, but the pilot persisted like a quiet weather. It did not announce itself loudly, but it changed daily life a little. One evening, as the office emptied and Elliot lingered, he remembered the scrap of paper with a single word. He thought of the way Sam's translation had unlocked in him a memory of a home he had been too busy to notice. He thought of the boy offering half a pastry. He understood that the $1,000 had never been the heart of the matter. It had been the bait for a lesson he had been unwilling to learn until a small hand forced his attention. He leaned back in his chair and watched the city glow beyond the glass, and for once the glow did not look like rows of opportunities to leverage.
It looked like lights and windows, many of them warm, and he felt, faintly, that this was where his decisions should aim. The pantry filled with basic staples, rice, beans, canned tomatoes, then with toothbrushes and bus passes. A small roster of employees learned how to sit with someone who needed help filling out an application without glancing at their watch. Elliot kept showing up. He stood at the counter in the converted pantry and ladled soup into paper bowls. He sat across from Rosa at a folding table and watched her point slowly at a block of small print, the way a person points at a map they've never read. He learned to photocopy IDs and to call the clinic to check appointment times. These were banal things to many who had never had to navigate them. To Rosa, they were bridges. She began to sleep better in the weeks after she met with the liaison the company funded. She started to pick up forms with less fear. Her laugh returned in short, quick bursts during conversations, and when she smiled at the volunteers, it felt neither pleading nor demanding, only human. Sam kept his guard carefully measured. He accepted a place on an after-school reading program at the community center, not because he imagined it would change the arc of his life overnight, but because it was warm and because there were books he had not touched before. In the library's low light, he discovered words that made images in his head bloom. Someone gifted him a small, used soccer cleat as part of a donation, and he treasured it as if it were the only cleat in the world. The company's pilot began to generate small, measurable outcomes. A few clients successfully completed housing forms with help. 2 people who had been chronically late to interviews because of unreliable transit received bus passes and made it to interviews on time. One volunteer used her HR skills to help a neighbor assemble a resume, and that neighbor landed a part-time shift at a local cafe. The liaison, hired as a modest role in the pilot, kept careful notes: names, appointments, progress.
Numbers were imperfect, and heartbeats were not statistics, but small arcs of improvement started to appear on the monthly report. Not everyone was pleased. Mark continued his drumbeat of skepticism. He sent pointed emails that asked for ROI projections and risk assessments. He questioned the wisdom of allocating staff time to what he called mission drift. His tone suggested he feared losing control. In staff meetings, he smiled in a manner that suggested charity should not interrupt quarterly goals. Others who shared his caution worried about precedent, about the slippery bank of precedent that might spill corporate resources into uncharted territories. But there were subtle tides shifting inside the company. People who had ladled soup once found the experience sticky in a way numbers weren't.
An account manager who had never spoken to people affected by homelessness before stayed an extra half hour to help Rosa fill out a form, and later mentioned in a performance review how the experience had made him better at empathizing with a client who had a messy personal life. A receptionist started a monthly bake sale where proceeds went to the pantry. Small rituals took root: a rota for kitchen shifts, an internal newsletter column that featured a neighbor's story, a bulletin board with photos of volunteers and the things they had helped arrange. Elliot felt the work press on him in new ways. He fielded questions from the board, some of which were concerned and some performatively curious. He accepted that his role now included defending a choice that had started as a soft private discomfort in a parking lot and had become a slow-moving institutional initiative. He wrote memos, he appeared at meetings, he signed approvals for line items and budgets, and then, in quieter moments, he took the bus to the community center to sit and listen. There were moments when the pilot did not work. Paperwork would be lost, dates would be missed, small expectations would crash into the bureaucracy of public systems. Rosa waited in a clinic line only to be told her ID needed a different form of verification. There were nights when volunteers did not show and the pantry had less than expected. Those moments taught hard lessons, that intention without structure becomes anecdote, and that goodwill requires the scaffolding of systems to become sustainable. Sam learned to expect less and appreciate more. His trust in adult promises was cautious, not brittle. When Elliot secured a small voucher that covered a night at a family shelter for Rosa in an emergency, neither of them declared victory. They filed the receipt next to other paperwork and continued to meet. When a volunteer disappeared from the rota, Sam noticed and didn't let it define the whole. He had seen both generosity and neglect. He had decided to choose small hope over cynicism. As the months moved, the company's pilot became a case study in the internal newsletter. The piece did not sensationalize. It reported on the hours volunteered, the number of people assisted, and the first tangible outcomes. One small tenancy secured with paperwork help, 2 people with ID cards in hand, and a resident who, after attending a resume workshop, started a part-time job. It also noted where the program needed improvement. The report caught the eye of a local nonprofit director, and a collaboration began, informal at first. Shared resources, joint workshops, a mutual referral route. Mark continued to rile and challenge. He brought a consultant in to advise on alignment. The consultant asked pointed questions about sustainability, about how to measure success beyond media smiles. Elliot listened. He did not have all the answers.
But he had in his pocket a different measure: the look on Sam's face when he returned a completed form to Rosa and watched hope settle over her features like a quiet blanket. Sometimes, metrics are not charts, but small gestures becoming steady. One winter morning, when the air had the brittle clarity of cold, Elliot received an email that would force his hand in an unexpected way. The community center had a waiting list for a family housing program. A room had opened for someone at risk of long-term homelessness. The liaison proposed a partnership contribution to fast-track an application for Rosa. The program required a financial commitment to secure the opening. Elliot approved it that afternoon. It was, he realized, not grand in sum when measured against company revenue, and yet it felt like a line drawn in a personal ledger that had been blank for a long time. Rosa's application was accepted. The day she received the call, she wept softly in the drop-in room as she clutched the liaison's hand and then Sam's small shoulder. There was no trumpeting. There was only a careful, practical plan being put in place. Transit to appointments, scheduled meetings with a caseworker, paperwork to be gathered. The house was not mansioned or romanticized. It was modest and secure. It meant that for a while, the nights would be regular and the order of daily life might give way to breathing room. Elliot did not stand in the way of the messy work required afterward.
He signed the check and insisted on meeting Rosa in person to hear about what the new place meant to her. She told him in a manner that was plain and without rhetorical flourish, "It means I can sleep without checking the alley." The sentence landed on him like a small truth. He thought of the postcard shoved into a drawer, the word Ogar lodged in his memory like a pebble, and he felt a current of grief for the years when his life had been compartmentalized into tasks and transactions. In the office, change nudged habits. Teams that had once been indifferent to the pantry now asked when the next volunteer shift would be. A small group of employees petitioned for paid volunteer hours, arguing that time given to community engagement could return an employee satisfaction. The petition did not pass without argument, but it amplified a quiet shift. People wanted to be involved on terms that respected their lives. There were still skeptics, but the chorus diminished. Mark was not entirely placated. He wrote memos that carefully traced resource allocation and risk. He demanded that the program present quarterly milestones. When the first internal metrics showed modest positive shifts in employee engagement in units where people had volunteered, his argument softened from scorn to caution. If the program had to be defended, let it be with robust evidence. Elliot agreed. He did not want to defend a project with platitudes.
He tasked Hannah with developing a framework that measured outputs, hours volunteered, forms completed, and outcomes, appointments kept, applications accepted. Hannah approached the work like a builder. She created templates and a feedback loop and tightened some of the pilot's loose ends. Meanwhile, Sam continued to grow in small, visible ways. He read aloud one afternoon to a group of younger children at the library. His voice trembled at first and then found its cadence. For the first time, the line between being seen as a child in need and being seen as a child with gifts thinned. He learned the names of volunteers. He learned to ask adults questions without fear of being dismissed. He began, slowly, to imagine futures that were not limited to immediate subsistence. One evening, some months after that wet summer afternoon when the word Ogar had split Elliot's routine, there was an invitation. The community center arranged a small gathering to mark the pilot's first 6 months. A modest table, simple speeches, soup shared in a room warmed by fluorescent lights and good intentions. Elliot went because he had promised to be present. He expected to give a short, corporate-appropriate reflection about the benefits of community engagement. What he did not anticipate was how uncomfortable he would be being the subject of gratitude in a way that cut through the performative parts of his life. People spoke. Rosa stood, and with a voice that trembled, thanked the volunteers who had helped her fill out forms. She did not direct her words to Elliot alone. She thanked the anonymous hands that had offered time and patience. Sam climbed onto a small chair and recited a short poem he'd learned in his reading group. Words about dreaming under a roof, about warm soup, about small hands offering more than they had. The room laughed and clapped, simple sounds that felt like pulses. Elliot listened, then stepped forward to speak. He had drafted a paragraph in his head about stewardship and corporate responsibility. Instead, he said a few plain sentences about being imperfect and about learning. He admitted that he had not had answers for everything and that the company had a lot to learn. He thanked the volunteers and the community center, and then said with a steadiness new in him, "We are learning together how to translate what we have into what others need." After the gathering, as people packed up folding chairs and cleaned counters, a small figure approached Elliot. It was Sam, clutching something wrapped in waxed paper. The boy's face was earnest and cautious. He held the parcel out with both hands, as if it were the most natural, inevitable thing in the world. "I made this," Sam said. "Grandma says it's not much, but it's warm. We saved for a little flour and sugar. She baked it this morning." He swallowed. "For you." Elliot accepted the parcel. It smelled like yeast and warmth, faintly sweet, and faintly of a kitchen's early light. He felt, absurdly, the same awkwardness he had felt the day the boy offered half a pastry. The smallness of the gift squared against the vastness he had in his bank and his capacity to change many lives with gestures large enough to register in headlines. He felt also something else. This offering had no entitlement attached. It was a true gift. He opened the paper and found a small, carefully made hand pie.
the crust folded with a tenderness that suggested hands skilled in thrift and persistence. There was a ribbon of jam in the center, bright and honest. Elliot felt an urge spring up in him, a raw, surprising urge, to break the crust there in front of the boy and eat it with him like two people sharing a meal. He thought of the $1,000 he had once offered as a joke, and how that time and money could never have coaxed this gift into his hands. The pastry was not a return on investment. It was a currency of another kind. He sat down on a folding chair in the kitchen and began to eat with Sam. The first bite was warm and cracked softly. Elliot's throat tightened. The pastry tasted of flour, of heat, of someone's careful saving, and of a grandmother's hands. He felt his face flush with something like grief, quick and private. Sam watched him as if he expected nothing, and yet hoped for something simple: recognition. "Thank you," Elliot said, his voice small. "No problem," Sam answered, and then, more confidently, "Grandma says we say gracias." Elliot smiled and told the boy he would remember this. It was a promise that had no ledger, no slide deck. It was simply a human acknowledgement. He thought of every procedural step the company had taken in the months since the parking lot. He thought of the nights Rosa did not have to check the alley because a space and housing had arrived. He thought of the library where a boy had learned the sound and weight of words he had once only half heard. The next weeks were not a crescendo into perfection. The pilot struggled with funding in the next fiscal round. Mark pushed hard at a board meeting for budget restraint. Elliot stayed and continued to argue for the pilot, not because it made him look good, but because it had, quietly, changed the lives of people he knew by name. He presented the liaison's reports and Rose's progress, and he spoke plainly about what would happen if the funding were cut. The services would shrink, and the fragile momentum would ease into loss. Some of the executives softened at the human stories. Others remained cautious. The board approved a smaller-than-asked budget, but did not cancel the pilot. It was enough to continue, though it required more resourcefulness and community partnerships to fill the gaps. Meanwhile, word of the company's small kitchen and paperwork help spread among neighbors. Other local businesses began to offer in-kind donations.
A baker from a nearby cafe volunteered to teach a simple pastry class at the community center, helping Sam and others learn to prepare inexpensive, nourishing food. The class filled quickly, and Sam attended with a seriousness that made his grandmother proud. He learned to measure sugar and flour and to fold dough. He learned in small, practical terms how to create warmth that could be shared. Mark watched these developments with a proprietary skepticism that slowly gave way to something like pragmatic acceptance. In a moment that surprised other staff, he phoned the liaison himself to ask about volunteer schedules and how his unit might contribute to meal shifts. He did not make a speech about the moral arc of his life. He asked a logistical question. There was still a hard edge to him, but it softened with time, like metal that had been worked and smoothed by repeated tasks. Elliot kept his own private reckonings. The postcard that had sat in a drawer for years was no longer an unread relic. He visited the small town where his mother lived, not to be placated by nostalgia, but to be present with a ruthlessness that had been missing in previous years. He brought with him no fanfare, only a suitcase and a willingness to listen. The visit did not erase decades of distance, but it built a beginning of reconnection. Calls returned, dinners shared, the truth that relationships require service as much as they require sentiment. The pilot matured into a steady program. Volunteer hours were scheduled. The kitchen became a place where employees and neighbors cooked together, not for cameras, but because it became for many a place of honest work. Quotes in the newsletter became less about the number of sandwiches distributed and more about the relationships formed. The company built partnerships with local organizations that possessed expertise the company lacked. The liaison coordinated appointments and created a small glossary of common paperwork pitfalls, a kind of reader's guide to bureaucracy that helped neighbors navigate forms and requirements. For Sam, life continued to give and take. There were teenage tensions, scraped knees, and moments of boredom where he wanted to disappear into the hum of digital worlds he could not always access. There were teachers who recognized his quiet diligence and encouraged him to apply for a scholarship to a weekend program at a youth center. He did not always believe he would be selected, but he applied. He learned to trust that adults could keep some of their promises. One late spring,
Almost a year after the parking lot incident, the community center invited Elliot to see the mural that Sam and other children had painted on its back wall. The mural was bright, naive in a way that made professional critics smile indulgently. A row of houses under a big, sheltering sky, hands reaching toward each other, a small child offering a pastry to a man in a suit.
The painting was not art meant for galleries. It was the honest work of a group that wanted to remember the story it had lived through. Elliot stood before the mural and felt the hot pressure behind his eyes again. He read the mural as if it were a map of his own recent life. There was, painted in a child's hand, the word Hogar. He thought of the boy who had first made it mean anything to him. He looked around at the volunteers and the neighbors and saw faces he could now name without the thin distance of long legs and business cards. He felt small and enormous at once. Sam approached with a wobble of pride and led the tour. He pointed at the painted pastry and at the painted man with a suit, and then at the words. "We all paint what we wish," he said, "but we also need to work to make it true." Elliot nodded. He wanted in that instant to make a promise that would be both practical and humble. He announced simply that the company would commit to continuing the kitchen and the liaison role for another year, and would increase the partnership with the community center to include a youth scholarship fund. He did not make the kind of statement that solved systemic problems. He made the kind of commitment that acknowledged the limits of his resources while recognizing his obligation to act. There was an applause that was not performative. It came from people who had sweated over stoves and who had sat through long lines at clinics. It came from volunteers who had scrubbed dishes and copied IDs. It was an applause that sealed a small agreement. They would work together to translate resources into durable help. The story did not end there. A year that followed would bring setbacks. The budget tightened, a key liaison moved on, and bureaucracy delayed a tenancy renewal. But it also brought constellations of small victories. An adult learner who completed a GED, a mother who finally received disability benefits because someone accompanied her to the appointment, and Sam winning a small award for reading at the library. And then, one bright morning, Sam arrived at the office with a different kind of confidence. He had a folded paper in his hand and an envelope. He had been saved in part by skills learned in the center's classes. He had applied for a small internship at a neighborhood bakery connected to the cafe that had taught the pastry class. The internship offered a modest stipend and a chance to learn a trade. When Elliot heard the news, he felt an uncomplicated joy. A month later, Sam came by the office with a small parcel, this time not a pastry, but a note and a token. The note was brief, written in careful block letters. "Thank you for making room." The token was a button sewn from leftover fabric, its center stitched with a tiny loop of thread that suggested a small handcrafted emblem. Sam explained that the button was meant to be a reminder, for Elliot to wear when he needed to remember why he had started a program, and for Sam to keep when he needed courage. Elliot pinned the button to his jacket and felt the weight of it like a small, private insignia. He asked Sam what the words in the note meant to him. Sam shrugged and said, "It means we worked, and now there's a little more room in our heads for the next thing." The CEO was not immune to critics. There were op-eds by people who thought corporations should not meddle in social services. There were employees who felt participation was optional, and others who felt imposed upon. Policy debates simmered. But for every skeptical article, there was a neighbor who expressed relief when they could finally file a form with confidence. For every internal complaint, there was a volunteer who described, in a review, how an hour a week had softened the edges of their life and changed how they treated colleagues. Elliot's transformation was not overnight or absolute. He still scheduled board meetings and negotiated contracts. He still measured outcomes and balanced budgets. But when he walked into the kitchen now, he recognized more faces and used fewer phrases about visibility and more about partnership. He had learned that translating money into meaningful help required listening, not monologues. He had learned that dignity resides in process as much as outcome. On a late summer evening, as the sun slanted low and the parking lot began to cool, Elliot found himself, again, walking past the black sedan where the pastry had first been hidden. He felt no need to recreate the scene. The memory was sharp, but not performative. He had learned to sit with the disquiet that prompted action and to allow action to be accountable. He checked his watch, then smiled, then walked across the lot to the community center, where a street festival celebrating the pilot's one-year anniversary was underway. The festival had simple booths, a table of donated books,
a stall where volunteers served soup, a small stage where children performed. Sam and Rosa were there, and Rosa's new place had become a small, stabilizing rhythm in her days. She greeted Elliot with a warmth that was not indebted, but grateful. She handed him a paper cup of soup, and with a wink, asked him to sit rather than preside. He sat. Later, when the stage cleared and the crowd thinned, Sam approached Elliot with another parcel. He had saved again, this time to buy a small notebook and some colored pencils. Inside the cover, in careful looping handwriting he had learned to study through practice, Sam had written a note. For when you forget why you started, keep it. The note was a map of the small things that had mattered: the pastry, the kitchen, the forms, the mural. He had illustrated the corner with a tiny drawing of two hands offering and receiving. Elliot felt the familiar prickle behind his eyes.
He thought of how he had once offered $1,000 as a joke, imagining translation as a one-time purchase. He thought about how that offer had ricocheted into something else, a demand on his integrity, a sequence of obligations that required his time and humility. He had been given, by a small boy, a constant reminder that the richest translations are not priced by dollar bills. He kept the notebook on his desk. When meetings became fractious and numbers loomed like storms, he would open it and read Sam's neat lines and the tiny sketches and remember the parking lot's summer heat. It was a small ritual that steadied him. It made him more patient with the slow bureaucracy he had once sued for efficiency. It made him more willing to tolerate slow wins. The ripples spread in ways nobody had predicted. Some employees built long-term volunteer collaborations. A local scholarship fund was seeded by modest company contributions matched by employee fundraising. The community center grew its roster of programs and secured additional funding from other partners who saw the company's model and were inspired to collaborate. The liaison left for a bigger nonprofit position but returned occasionally to consult, proud of the program she had helped shape from the ground up. Mark, for his part, continued to watch budgets and projections with a practiced eye. If his skepticism lessened, it was because he began to accept that there are returns other than financial, returns of trust, of employee engagement, of reputation that is more than glossy marketing. He did not wax sentimental, but he did allocate staff time when asked. His emails grew shorter on the topic. He began to delegate the minutiae to Hannah's careful spreadsheets. Elliot did not become a saint. He continued to make imperfect choices and to respond imperfectly to critique. But his life contained a new set of anchors: an after-school program he checked in on, a pantry he helped stock, a small scholarship fund that paid for a child to attend a music camp. These were not cures for systemic problems, but they were stitches in a larger fabric. They were, he told himself on hard days, what he could do. On a quiet afternoon, months after the mural was painted and the anniversary festival faded into the memory of a successful day, Elliot sat in the drop-in room with the company liaison and the center's director. They were discussing expansion, more volunteer hours, a partnership with a local training program, perhaps a pledge to help fund one more caseworker. As they spoke, Sam entered with 2 paper cups of lemonade and handed one to him. The gesture was small and exactly beautiful. Elliot accepted and for a moment simply held the cup, the cold spilling into his palm. "Everything okay?" Sam asked, his head cocked, with the practical curiosity of someone accustomed to asking and receiving clear answers. "Yes," Elliot said, and then, more honestly, "it's better than okay." Sam grinned, then, as if mischief had never left his small shoulders, asked, "Remember when you said you'd pay someone $1,000 to translate a scrap of paper?" Elliot had the reflex to laugh. It was a different kind of laugh now, less sharp, more aware. "I do," he replied, "and I think you translated something for me that money couldn't buy." Sam shrugged with the modesty of a child who did not presume to teach kings. "We translated each other," he said. "You changed and we got help. Fair trade." Elliot folded his hands and thought about the trade-off. He had given money, sure. He had written checks. He had allocated budget lines. But the real translation had been in the way a society's capacities, access, stability, paperwork navigation, the ability to make calls, had been converted into the small daily things that allow people to sleep without fear and to open a mailbox without worry.
those conversions required more than dollars. They required attention and patience, and above all, respect. At the office, the mural's image of a hand offering a pastry to a suited man remained a quiet provocation. It invited people to remember one small, sharper truth. Generosity rests not on spectacle, but on the willingness to rearrange one's schedule, to be inconvenienced by human need, and to make systems more accessible. Elliot's own schedule had changed accordingly. He cut fewer apologies in the staff meeting and offered fewer statements about giving back in press releases. He let the work speak, imperfectly and persistently, in the results people could point to and in the lives that had, in small ways, stabilized. Years later, when asked in a staff interview what had compelled him to act that day in the parking lot, he would tell the truth, tersely and without flourish. A boy gave me half a pastry and called the only word I needed to remember into the open. It was the simplest, loudest test. The company kept the pantry and the kitchen. The liaison's role expanded into a fuller community engagement position. Rosa's housing stabilized into a routine where she was able to take odd jobs and sleep without the frequent worry of losing a shelter bed. Sam finished middle school and kept a stack of notebooks filled with drawings and lists and the occasional small poem. He worked weekends at the bakery and learned to weigh flour by feel. He kept the button Elliot had worn for a while and would later hand it to another young person as a token of what it meant to remember why you start. Elliot never again offered money in a parking lot as a joke. The offer looked foolish to him in retrospect, a thinking heave that assumed translation and meaning can be purchased at a single price. He had learned that translation, the act of converting what one has into what another needs, requires relationship. Money can help, but it is not sufficient without accompaniment.
On an autumn afternoon, when the city had that thin, luminous quality that seems to make everything more honest, Elliot walked by the black sedan and paused. He thought of that first laugh and of the small scrape of handwriting on a page. He thought of the boy who had called out, and of the grandmother who had stitched blankets, and of the many small acts that had followed. He reached into his pocket and found the notebook Sam had once given him, the small book with its childlike illustrations. He smoothed the cover and remembered the many small promises and the one larger commitment to translate resources into dignity whenever he could. He understood, finally, and more clearly than he had in the beginning, the full shape of what had occurred. The $1,000 offer had been the initial spark. It had created a scene. But it took the boy's gift of half a pastry and a single honest word to make the scene mean anything. The translation that mattered was not the conversion of a foreign word into English for cash. It was the translation of distraction into responsibility, of indifference into the messy business of care. It was the conversion of status into service. If someone asked him to explain the lesson in one sentence, Elliot would have been tempted to give a neat aphorism. But the truth resisted neatness. The lesson was more like a practice. Notice, listen, act, and then act again in small, measured ways. The boy who had shared his warmth had taught the richest lesson. He had offered not bargaining chips, but a mirror. At the end of the day, Elliot kept the small button Sam had given him pinned to the inside of his jacket. It was no badge of honor to show anyone. It was a private tool. A reminder to translate, not to buy, but to convert what he had into what others needed, thoughtfully and patiently. And sometimes, when the world required translation that could not be bought, he would take the notebook from the drawer, read the cramped lines in the tiny drawings, and remember the pastry, the kitchen, the mural, and the patient, steady work of turning capacity into care. He would remember that the boy had, with a small, ordinary courage, shocked him, gently, absolutely, into becoming the kind of person who would, instead of merely remarking. He would remember that the most valuable translations are not priced in dollars, but in the willingness to stay and to build. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small things can change big lives.